Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. We're breaking down the basics of all political issues and current political events so that you get to decide. And we're doing just that today, breaking down the basics of elections and voting with Dr. Lisa Bryant. She chairs the Department of Political Science at Fresno State with expertise particularly in the areas of election administration, public opinion and political behavior, campaigns and elections, and gender and representation. She's an expert on MIT's Election Data and Science Lab, has been thoroughly published, granted, and awarded, and she's just the person to break down the basics of U.S. elections and voting for us today. Dr. Bryant, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us today on Politically Basic.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to dig right in. Will you please share with us what the basics of elections are? What system do we operate under in the United States of America?
Okay, well, we have an extremely complicated system in the United States. So we have a representative republic. And, you'll hear people talk about, are we a democracy or are we a republic? And in fact, a representative republic is a democratic form of government where we choose our representatives who represent us in our state and our federal government through a process of elections. And so elections are the way that we get to decide who represents the best interests collectively of us in our various districts. And when I said that we have a complicated system, I really meant it. So we have, as citizens and residents, we live in multiple districts. So any given election, we are electing representatives for us from various levels of government. So the federal government through the House of Representatives and the Senate. We'll talk about the president, which is a different kind of election. We then also elect our state assembly or state representative and state senators. We elect our mayors, our city councilors, our county commissioners, our county board of supervisors. We have over 67,000 special districts in the United States. So water boards, air boards, school boards, right? We elect a lot of people in the United States, and our federalist system, where states sort of get to decide how the rules around voting work, make it even more complicated. But I think to take it down to the nuts and bolts, we have a representative form of government that we elect people into office in a democratic system of voting. And that's why voting is so important.
It's a good system. It's a fair system.
It causes some problems for us, right? But, it's better than everybody being hand-selected by only by, let's say, party elites, and that you don't get to decide whether or not that person actually represents your interests. And so I think it does feel like then you have a voice in government and you have some input into who it is that's speaking for you in this representative system.
Absolutely. And then what about voting? How do we do that here in the United States?
Yeah, so we're also a little bit different than a lot of sort of what we would call advanced democracies. In the United States, we are responsible for registering ourselves to vote in all states except for North Dakota. North Dakota does not have a voter registration requirement. Many people often ask why. They're a very small state. They just still haven't implemented it because for a long time, people just knew people in their community and didn't necessarily require it. So 49 states, D.C., and our districts, Guam, Virgin Islands, they require us as individuals to register ourselves to vote. That is a little bit different than some places where the state might automatically register you when you turn 18 to vote, or whatever the voting age in those countries are. It can vary by country. And so here, there are some states that are sort of playing with the idea of automatic registration, or at least reaching out to people when they reach legal voting age and saying, you're now legally eligible to vote. Here's how you can do that. But ultimately, it falls on you, the citizen, to register yourself to vote. And there are a few requirements. You do have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to be 18 years of age to vote in statewide and federal elections. There's a movement for what's called Vote 16 to try and reduce the voting age to 16 in some local jurisdictions. And there's been a couple places where that has picked up. But by and large, the age to vote is 18. So citizen, 18 years of age, and then you have to reside in the jurisdiction where you're registering to vote. So in your county, usually, is where you register to vote, though you can vote with the Secretary of State or your statewide election official's office, and then your county is responsible for maintaining your registration in the nuts and bolts of it. But basically, you have to register before you can vote, and that is on you, the citizen.
And we're not required to legally. It's a choice. And so let's talk current voter registration numbers across the country. If we're choosing to do so, what is that looking like?
So we're actually looking better than we did for a long time. There's this myth sort of that only half of Americans vote, but we actually saw, as of 2020 anyway, about 77% of eligible citizens in the U.S. are registered to vote. And in 2020, it was a really high turnout election year. We saw about 67% turnout. So, the sort of old myth that only half of the people voting, that has been being chipped away at, I think. So about 2/3 of us are turning out and voting, but about 3/4 of us are actually registered to vote. So by and large, I think that we're pretty comparable with other countries where you have the right to choose whether or not to register and vote. Countries like Canada, Great Britain, our numbers are pretty comparable. Australia, other countries, of course, where it's required by law, conscription, you see higher numbers, but people don't necessarily turn out in higher numbers, or where turnout's required. Sometimes you see conscientious objectors. They turn out sort of in name only, but they can do what's called a protest vote, where they can, sort of cross out their ballot and things like that. So you see a lot of variation, but we're pretty comparable to most of our, allied nations in terms of thinking about citizens being responsible for their own registration and having the right to vote if they want to.
And can you share about the different types of election cycles? Like, we're in a presidential election year now, but there are these cycles called midterms. What are all the different election cycle types that we have in this country?
Okay, so we have a lot. So I will start with the big one. Most everybody pays attention to elections in presidential election years. And there's a couple of reasons that's true. One, the president is a really important person in our system of government. They have a lot of power, but they also are the spokesperson for the country, right? And so how do we want our country represented to the world? So a lot of people pay attention to those elections. So in a general election, presidential election year, you tend to see a lot of attention, a lot of coverage to elections. In the even years that are non-presidential years, so for example, this is 2024. In 2026, we will have what's called a midterm election cycle. The president will not be up for election, but all 435 members of the House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years. And so the reason we call it a midterm is because it's halfway through the president's term in office. And those representatives are running again. Some states will put their gubernatorial elections on midterm cycles, so that your top of the ticket is the governor in those years. And that's a sort of way to help try and boost turnout a little bit, and also so that governors can run and not have to compete with the president and all the presidential coverage, and then governors can have a little bit more coverage as well. Not all states do that, but a fair number of states do. And so midterm elections are the even year House of Representative elections that are not in the same year as the president. Besides those elections, we also, a lot of places in the United States separate out city elections and school board elections. We vote a lot in the United States. On almost every Tuesday of the year, there's an election going on. And in some places, they have elections even on other days that are not Tuesdays. And so it's never not election season in the United States. But the presidential election and the midterm elections are the big ones that a lot of people pay attention to, especially the media.
Well, that's a true statement. Let's talk about how this has shifted across different cycles, and let's just talk presidential election years. You mentioned that turnout was particularly high in 2020, but that was a weird year for us, right? That was a really different type of election season and election year because we had a pandemic, and we heard a whole lot more about mail-in ballots. How have things changed since before 2020 and post-2020 in terms of how our elections are run?
Well, that's a great question. So prior to 2020, you had, if we're talking about how we vote, whether you vote in person or whether you vote by mail, Vote by mail was pretty common in a lot of places. There were many states that already had vote by mail, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but especially in the West. Vote by mail has been really popular in the West for at least the last 20 years or so. The West is, as most people who look at a map can tell, pretty sparsely populated, and there's big wide distances between towns in the West. You know, when you think of places like Wyoming and New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado. And so vote by mail is very popular in those places because people wouldn't have to travel so far to a voting location. In states in the Midwest and east of the Mississippi, where jurisdictions are close to each other and towns are close to each other and people didn't have to travel that far, vote by mail was not as common. It still existed, and most of the time we would call it absentee voting, and there's two types. There's no excuse absentee voting, where a state doesn't require you to have a reason to have to not vote in person. And then there's ones that require, you know, maybe you're in the hospital, maybe you spend the winter in another state, something like that. And they require you to provide some sort of reason and documentation on why you can't vote in person. That was a lot more common prior to 2020. But then the pandemic hit and there were lockdowns. And so a lot of states adopted vote by mail to allow people to be able to vote, but without having to go stand in lines at voting locations and precincts. And as you know, some jurisdictions have a tendency to have really long lines and really crowded vote centers and precincts. And so in a way to try and minimize the spread of COVID-19 or coronavirus in 2020, a lot of states adopted vote by mail. So we saw really high vote by mail rates in 2020. In 2022 midterm election, we saw those numbers drop back again, down, in eastern states. In states where vote by mail was not historically used, we saw people want to return to in-person voting in higher numbers. In the West, they're still really high. People still like to vote by mail. And there's a couple of reasons. Vote by mail is convenient, so you can do it at your home. People say that, they can go on the internet, they can look up information about things that you might not pay a lot of attention to, like various ballot propositions or constitutional amendments, or, if you live in a town that has measures, direct democracy state like Iowa or California, there might be some ballot propositions that were put on by citizens that you're not very familiar with. You can go and you can research those things and look them up while you have your ballot in front of you. And so some people really like that aspect. Some people who maybe have a disability and it's difficult for them to get to a vote center or voting location, they find it a better way to vote because they can have somebody in their home assist them, or they just have to put it in their mail. They don't have to go anywhere to take their ballot. But people like to vote in person too. People like to go see their ballot put into a voting machine. They like to be able to push the button and pull the lever. And so people have different preferences. So most places have options. People can vote in person if that's what they enjoy and they like and they feel more confident about. And some people, if vote by mail works better for them, then they have an option to vote by mail as well. So those are the two primary ways that we vote. There's a third sort of almost hybrid convenience measure, but it's called early in-person voting. So many states have vote centers that are open for maybe 4 days or 11 days or something prior to election day. You get the opportunity to still go vote in person, but your ballot you feed it into the machine, but those ballot tabulations can't happen until election day. So it's not like your ballot gets counted. So in some ways, it's almost more like voting by mail, that like you sent your ballot in, but it's not actually being tabulated yet, than on election day where, it gets counted that day. So,
well, we have a lot of different ways that people can vote to match the needs of voting citizens. And our process is validly complex for reasons and good reason. But in 2020, most people were home. There was a lot of confusion, I think, over the ways that people were getting ballots and getting ballots back. And of course, we all heard about and read, and some people experienced very odd things going on with polling places and votes being maybe switched or miscounted or really concerning things happening. Now, there was a lot of misinformation swirling over this, but also a lot of good questions came out of it over what went down in 2020 with the presidential election. There are still questions about election integrity today. Do you think those concerns are valid? And what would you say maybe are the biggest concerns that people have and that we need to be looking out for in this election?
Sure. I think there's a couple different components to that question that we should address. So in 2020, there's new processes. There's this idea that, ballots are being mailed in, and especially during COVID, not necessarily a lot of, poll workers that are there working the polls or election observers. Normally in elections, in a precinct location or a vote center location, election observers might stand and watch the process of voting, and that's perfectly legal. Parties and groups who are interested in voting rights and election integrity can have people observe the election process, which is a good thing. We want election observers, and as Americans for many, many years, we would send Americans to other countries to observe their elections to make sure that election integrity was being upheld. And so that's a positive thing. And I think in 2020, there was some concern that there wasn't that type of activity taking place in as much. But in terms of, votes being switched and people voting who weren't supposed to, there have been numerous audits. There have been numerous lawsuits about this where evidence was presented. And, at last count, it was over 200 lawsuits. And yet none of those have actually provided evidence or found any rulings that election tampering was changing votes or changing results or things like that. So I think that misinformation serves a political purpose in elections, right? The intent here is to try and cast doubt on whether elections are being run, fairly and whether or not the correct people are winning elections. And we absolutely should care about election integrity. We should make sure that we have good chain of custody processes. And so for maybe your viewers who don't know what a chain of custody is, that is the idea that when I go into a voting location, I give my name, or depending on what state you're in, I might give my ID. I vote my ballot. And then what happens to my ballot after that? Do I feed it into a machine? If I live in a place like South Dakota, I drop it into a box still, believe it or not. And what happens to my ballot after that? So in a place where, maybe I see it feed into the machine, the tabulator changes, and then I leave the polling location, what happens to my ballot after that? Well, a chain of custody is the idea that you have processes along the whole way, and that no one poll worker or election worker is handling your ballot by themselves. Things happen in teams. There's documentation of how many ballots were taken out of a machine at the end of the day. That should match how many people signed in that they voted that day. We create logs. We post them outside vote locations and precinct locations to show here's how many voters signed the voter log. Here's how many ballots were collected. That's how many were sent to the warehouse to be counted, right? And so those kinds of processes, having transparent processes, having them documented, allowing people to observe the counting process. So when those ballots arrive at the voter warehouse and they start to be counted, do you allow observers to observe the process? Do you have, bipartisan teams of poll workers and bipartisan teams of people counting? Is the media allowed to observe any of it, right? And so I think all of that is something that people should advocate for and should want as part of our election process. I think where, we have dealt with problems in 2020, certainly, and the rhetoric has changed a little from, say, 2016 to 2020 on where we think we should focus our attention about the security of our elections. I think that misinformation is much more of a political move than a true sort of, I think that the processes are bad or the processes are wrong or, election officials are engaging in nefarious sort of misconduct. I think that there hasn't really been any evidence to suggest that that's true, but there has certainly been evidence to suggest that it helps people make political gains.
In my lifetime, at least, whenever there was a presidential election, on election night, we would know who had won. There was that wonky year where we dealt with the hanging chads, and that went on and on. And that was a surprise to a lot of people. Then I don't think that we liked that as a nation, that we couldn't get the closure that we were looking for on election night. That has changed. Why has that changed, and why do we not now always know who has won that race by the end of election day?
That's a great question. So I think that it goes into a couple things. Knowing about history, we haven't always known, and the ballots haven't always been counted on election night. There's the famous picture of Harry Truman holding up the newspaper, right, that Dewey wins, which was wrong because the ballots were not finished being counted. Certainly, you're talking about 2000 and George W. Bush, where counting went on up until almost the point where it couldn't anymore because the Electoral College needed to meet and declare a president. What has changed, and the reason that our perception of ballots being counted by the end of election night has changed, is that our elections have gotten much, much closer. So if you look at the gaps in victories, right? If you look at Ronald Reagan's election, where Mondale carries one state, there's no question about who president is. So the TV networks and the media, the AP, it's not a risk for them to call those states immediately and to say, even though all the ballots are not finished being counted in Michigan, they know who's going to carry Michigan. Even though all the ballots are not finished being counted in California, they know who's going to carry California. So up until essentially 2000, when it flipped, if you remember, for your viewers who are younger, they might not have even been alive. But the maps and the sort of declared winner on election night in 2000 flipped back and forth from Bush to Gore to Bush to Gore several times. And I remember being up till 2 a.m. and finally saying, I got to go to sleep, like not knowing who the winner was going to be. After that election, if you go look at the margin of victory for, then when Bush runs in 2004, and then the 2008 election, even the 2012 election, Obama had a little bit more padding there in his margin of victory. But even that one is still pretty close when you compare it to elections when, say, you or I were young. And so that has made states more reluctant to say we're pretty sure that we know, even though all our ballots aren't counted. The ballots they were never all counted on election day, right? Never. But our perception was that they were, because we knew who the winner was, because the margins were much bigger. And now our margins are really tight. So if you look, if we have an election that's decided by less than 1%, then, people want that comfort of saying, like, well, who's going to be our next president? But I think that part of our responsibility, if we're going to continue to see elections this tight, is to get people comfortable with the idea that, like, it's okay to wait and to know the correct answer rather than think that we have to know it today. Because, if you think about it, really arbitrary, it's kind of an arbitrary deadline, right? It's like, this is election day. But okay, does it hurt us to wait and say we need to count all the ballots, we need to make sure they're accurate, we need to make sure that all the votes get counted? Not really. I think it's just that we've had this expectation, and certainly, the networks, they want to be the first to call everything. And so I think that, maybe sort of retraining the network behavior of having to be the first one out with information is part of the challenge here too.
Yeah, I think we do want to know right away. We're impatient. We're so impatient. There's been so much run up, especially in a presidential election. Yeah, we want to know.
Which, that's a whole nother, we could talk about that. That's a whole nother topic. Is our election cycle too long, right? Should we actually shorten the election cycles? Should we shorten the campaign period? Should we shorten the fundraising period? Would it make for more competitive elections? Would it make, I think the candidates would look completely different, if we did that. But, and some countries do have rules about that. Some countries only have a 180-day election period. They're always campaigning.
Yeah, ours are endless. Zero guardrails. I want to ask you about kind of a hot topic right now. It can be a little bit difficult and uncomfortable to traverse, but it's really important to ask about. So I know you're along for the ride here, and I appreciate you being open to letting me ask you about this. There's been some questioning over non-citizens voting, and reports of a Biden executive order that was ordering federal agencies to give voter registration forms to illegal aliens or people who had crossed the border and who are non-citizens in the United States right now. Now, again, this is a conversation ripe with opinions and thoughts and not as much concrete information, but it's certainly a question right now. And policies being kicked around about the future for people who have come across the border and not followed the legal process of entry that we have and who are not citizens right now. So maybe you can offer a little bit of insight, being an expert in this field. And as we are in the time that we are in right now, up against this question, it's a really big question. Right now, our laws say that you must be a U.S. citizen to vote. Where do you think things stand there?
I have not heard any discussion about changing the law for federal elections on citizen voting rights. So in most countries, that's not exclusive to the United States. In most countries, voting is a right of citizenship, not a right of residency. So there have been a couple of jurisdictions that have allowed residents to vote when it comes to things like property taxes, because if you own property, the logic is if you own property in a jurisdiction and you're paying taxes on it, that we shouldn't have taxation without representation, right? I mean, that is sort of the core of the founding of the country. And so there have been some local jurisdictions that have said you don't have to necessarily be a citizen as long as you're a property owner in this area to vote. As far as Biden executive order to distribute voter registration, I did not see or hear anything that it was to non-citizens at the border. What I did see is it was an executive order to try and increase the number of federal agencies that interact with the public to encourage voter registration. So similar to when you go to the DMV, which is, of course, a state agency, they have a voter registration question on there that's been there since the motor voter law was passed. Biden has said that federal agencies that engage with the public, so things like FAFSA, when people apply for federal student financial aid, or Department of Health and Safety, or Department of Transportation, if they have any forms or documents like that people apply for, then at that time they should be offered a voter registration form as well. I think that there is currently a lawsuit to try and stop that so that the federal government is not acting as an advocate for voter registration and voting rights. I have not heard about the Department of Immigration and Naturalization might offer it to people when they get their citizenship, but not, certainly if they're being detained as undocumented or citizens at the border, and green card holders are not allowed to vote either. So, I think that encouraging voter registration by federal agencies certainly now is going to be a question for the courts on whether or not the federal government is allowed to do that. They have historically been able to do that, so it would be interesting if that was found to be illegal. I think Chris Kobach out of Kansas is saying that he thinks that it oversteps states' rights in the 10th Amendment to control elections. And so that's what I've seen. I have not seen anything about undocumented citizens being encouraged to register and vote. And certainly that would not be in compliance with federal law. And then states have a responsibility to check those voter registrations too. And it's not allowed in any of the states.
Right. That'll be really interesting to track and see what happens with that too. Thank you for that information and clarification on that. And thanks for letting me ask. We want to know. And sometimes it's hard. Some of these topics can be difficult to broach, or we don't know who to ask, or, people have questions. And so I'm the one who's going to ask.
Well, and there's a lot of different election laws out there. And so I think that sometimes people don't know. We hear rumors. We hear, people tell us information, or you might pick up a piece of information on social media. Who knows where that originated? I always say, trust everything on social media. We should be a little bit skeptical about, because it's really hard to track down the origins of things. And that goes outside of voting elections too, of course. But certainly when it comes to voting in elections, it's a healthy amount of skepticism is not a bad thing.
Yeah, we call that trust but verify.
Right.
That's what my attorney tells me anyway, Lisa. Well, This is
That's a good question.
so helpful. I think so, especially now. So helpful to hear from you. And I want to leave this conversation with one last question and kind of on a broader topic of just voting in general. You know, we're always hearing every vote matters. It's so important that you exercise your duty as a citizen to participate in this process, to participate in electing those who are going to represent you and your community and your state and your country. What is your take on the importance and the value of every person who is able to voting?
But obviously, I think people should vote. I think that I remember, being young and I couldn't wait to vote. And so I always tell everybody, this is your voice, right? Whether or not you want to be, nostalgic or whatever, we fought a revolution for the right to have a voice, for the right to self-governance. And that self-governance is built on a foundation of voting, that we get to pick our representatives, we get to pick the people who are making laws on our behalf. And, one thing I hear all the time is people say, oh, all the candidates are the same, all the parties are the same. It doesn't really matter if I vote. But that's not true. I mean, I think that if you just look at any level of government, whether it's your city council, those people, especially city council, I think people really underestimate how important it is to vote for your local government offices and to pay attention to those local government offices. Because if you think about what your neighborhoods and your communities look like, do you want new school built in a certain location? Do you want housing to be built in a certain location? Maybe you don't want a shopping center or a warehouse put in your neighborhood, right? Well, who you vote to put on your city council matters because those are the people making those decisions. So it kind of, not to get mushy, but it kind of breaks my heart when people say that they don't think that their vote matters. I do think that every vote matters. And I think that cumulatively in the aggregate, all of our voices matter. It's like one grain of sand doesn't make a beach, right? Like all the grains of sand have to be there in order for us to have a beach. And for what kind of beach is it going to be? Is it going to be rocky? Is it going to be beautiful? And so I think of voting very similar to that. It really takes all of us. And when there's, more grains of sand and you have a big, beautiful beach, it's more enjoyable for everybody. And I kind of think of voting to be similar to that.
Very well said. And thank you for sharing that. Not mushy. We agree.
Okay.
We're very lucky that we have this right and that we can participate. So I echo you and encourage everybody to take advantage of that. Absolutely. And there are some communities that are small enough where races are determined, our outcomes are determined by a handful of votes. There's this infamous story. It's a true story. Somewhere in the Midwest, in a very, very, very tiny town, there was a man running for elected office. And on election day, he was too busy out on his farm attending to the livestock, and he missed the deadline to get over to his polling place and vote. And he didn't win because no one voted. There were zero votes in that race. And had he just taken a moment and gone and voted for himself, then he would have won. But I think it's always, I love telling that story, but it's terrible. Tough lessons learned sometimes, but sometimes it does just come down to the power of one vote. And it matters.
Every election, every election, I didn't hear that story, but I have heard one where a man was running for election and his wife thought her vote wouldn't matter, so she didn't vote that day, and he lost by one vote. And I think that was in Texas. And I just thought, that would be a tense household.
Yeah. Sure, they enjoyed dinner that evening together. I'm just kidding. Oh, my goodness. Well, it's so true. And you said it so well. This matters. Every grain of sand matters. Every vote matters. And we always encourage people to get registered. You have the right. No one's forcing you, but it's a wonderful way to express your wishes for your community and your country. So Dr. Bryant, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show with me today, breaking down the basics of elections and voting. Sometimes we don't scale it way back and talk about how we got here, why we do what we do. And it's really important to know. So thank you so much for sharing and being with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic. We're committed to breaking down the basics so you get to decide. Be sure to check us out at politicallybasic.com and follow us at Politically Basic so you don't miss an episode. We'll see you next time.